The year was 1064, and beneath the relentless blaze of Jerusalem's desert sun, a moment was taking shape that would sear itself into the histories of both Christendom and Islam. It was a tale that mocked logic itself, a confrontation so uneven it should have ended before it began. 800 Viking warriors, men already immortalized in the brutal sagas of the north, now faced a Saracen host of 40,000. To put it bluntly, every Viking would have to cut down 50 foes just to survive. By all reason, their fate was sealed. History is littered with small armies crushed under overwhelming might. And yet, what unfolded on those sun-bleached plains would shatter every rule of warfare, turning defeat into defiance and battle into legend. This was not simply a fight. It was the deliberate birth of myth, a tale meant to inspire the faithful, terrify the unbelievers, and justify centuries of holy bloodshed. But to understand how such an impossible encounter came to be, we must begin not under Jerusalem's burning sky, but in the mist-shrouded fjords of Norway. From there emerged a king straddling two worlds, one foot in the pagan past, the other in the Christian dawn, leading his people on a journey that would transform them into something the medieval world had never known. Before we follow them north, picture it: a tight square of warriors, shields gleaming under the merciless light, axes raised in silence so heavy it drowned out even the thought of fear. And across from them, a sea of banners whipping in the wind, war horns roaring, hooves pounding like thunder, and soldiers so countless they blurred into the horizon. If numbers decided wars, this story would end here. But this tale isn't about numbers. It's about belief, raw, unshakable belief, the kind that bends the laws of survival. It's about how fear can be turned into a weapon sharper than any blade. It's about faith so consuming that men no longer dread death, they crave it. And therein lies the riddle. How could 800 men outnumbered 50 to 1 stand, and even triumph, against an army of 40,000? The answer does not lie in muscle or steel, but in something far more potent: the strange alchemy of fanaticism, discipline, and psychological warfare. An alchemy that would unfold piece by piece, beginning in the icy waters of the north. What follows is no mere myth, no saga born from mead halls and long winters. It is history, recorded, reshaped, and weaponized over centuries. A story of men who believed they were chosen by God, and who fought with such merciless conviction that their enemies swore they must be demons. A story so extreme that, even 1,000 years later, it forces us to confront the question: what happens when faith itself becomes the deadliest blade on the battlefield? Our story now drifts north, to the wild coasts of Norway, where jagged mountains crash into deep fjords and storms lash the sea with cruel indifference. Here ruled King Magnus III, known to history as Magnus Barefoot. His name carried echoes of the old Norse spirit, born from his habit of wearing simple Scottish garments instead of royal robes. But that small detail was no quirk, it was a symbol. Magnus embodied a nation divided, the savage pride of its pagan heritage colliding with the sanctity of its newfound Christian soul. By Magnus' era, Christianity had swept across Scandinavia, replacing blood sacrifices with church bells and holy mass. Yet the old ways refused to die. The Norse had been molded by centuries of conquest, exploration, and death. The warrior code, the glory of dying with a weapon in hand, the lust for immortality through battle, could not be erased by sermons. Instead, something far more volatile occurred. The two beliefs fused. Pagan ferocity met Christian purpose, birthing a new kind of holy warrior, one who fought for both glory and God. Magnus heard the voice of Rome calling. Pope Alexander II urged Christian rulers to defend the holy lands of Jerusalem. For most European kings, these were political opportunities, chances to earn favor, land, and divine legitimacy. But Magnus saw something greater. Where others saw ambition, he saw destiny. He would merge the savagery of the Viking with the sanctity of faith. This was no act of calculation. Magnus believed it with every fiber of his being. He would forge his men into instruments of divine vengeance, warriors sanctified by blood and purpose. To him, the campaign ahead was not conquest. It was purification. His soldiers would not merely fight for their king, They would fight as extensions of heaven's will. Their deaths would not be defeats, but ascensions, each fallen warrior stepping through the fire of battle straight into paradise. But to bring this vision to life, Magnus needed more than mere warriors. He needed men who embodied the raw, untamed spirit of the North. Veterans of endless feuds between rival kingdoms. Men who had waded through blood on frozen fields and fought in smoke-choked halls. Survivors of raids from Ireland to Scotland and across the North Sea. Only those who had proven themselves in a dozen battles would be deemed worthy. Imagine the air in Norway during those preparations, tense, electric. Villages watched their strongest sons summoned not for plunder, but for something sacred. The clang of forges rang through the valleys as new axes were born, each one blessed before it was sheathed. Monks whispered Latin prayers while old runes were still carved into shields, a fragile peace between two worlds. At Magnus' command, the ancient sagas were not silenced, but rewritten. Where once they praised Odin and Thor, they now pointed toward the glory of the Christian God. And in this cold northern land, the seeds of fanaticism began to grow. Magnus was not assembling an army of mercenaries. He was forging a brotherhood of holy berserkers, men who believed their blood itself was consecrated for divine war. These were not mere soldiers. They were martyrs in waiting, hardened by training, bound by faith, and driven by conviction so absolute it could break the will of any foe. The world had never seen their like. Within months, these chosen few would sail south, carrying the frostbitten fury of Norway into the burning heart of the Holy Land. Magnus Barefoot's goal was not to lead a mob of farmers or fishermen across the sea. He sought a weapon, sharp, pure, and honed like a masterwork blade. His chosen number was deliberate, 800 men, no more. For Magnus, power lay not in numbers, but in purity. Each warrior was handpicked as if touched by God himself. Recruitment was ruthless. From Norway, Iceland, and the Scottish Isles came men whose veins still carried Viking fire. But Magnus wanted no youths or dreamers. He wanted scarred veterans, men who had stared death in the eye and laughed. Around the hearths, whispers spread that those chosen would never return. Yet to be passed over was a humiliation worse than death. Every recruit faced 3 trials. First, mastery of weaponry, not brute strength, but perfect control. The ability to split a shield with one blow and pivot to parry the next. Second, endurance. Men were driven through icy mountain passes without food or fire, tested by hunger and the merciless cold. Those who stumbled were sent home in shame. And third, Magnus did not simply want warriors, he wanted believers. Monks and priests filled the camps. At dawn, prayers were mandatory. At dusk, confessions whispered. Every blade was blessed before it was wielded. Barracks were arranged like chapels. Crucifixes hung beside shields painted with Norse symbols. Any man who refused to kneel was expelled, no matter his might. It was a revolution in Viking tradition. For centuries, Norsemen fought for gold, for glory, for their names to echo in song. Magnus demanded more, that they fight believing heaven itself had written their fate. A man with nothing to lose is deadly, but a man who welcomes death as salvation is unstoppable. Training was merciless. Days were spent drilling in formation, a discipline foreign to the Viking way. Gone were the reckless charges of berserkers. Now, they learned to fight shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, their survival bound to one another. Byzantine mercenaries, hired at great cost, taught them the tactics of phalanx and defense, shaping chaos into precision. The Norse instinct for wild fury was reforged into something colder and far more lethal. By night, hymns echoed through the camps, psalms sung in Latin over simple meals. Yet, in the flicker of firelight, some still whispered the old gods' names, Odin, Thor, unwilling to abandon them entirely. Magnus did not forbid it. In truth, he encouraged it, for he knew a truth few grasped. A man who believes he fights under both the gods of his ancestors and the God of salvation is twice as fearsome. By the end of their transformation, the 800 no longer thought of themselves as men. They were not mercenaries, nor raiders, nor even soldiers. They were living weapons, vessels of divine wrath, forged from ice and faith. Fanatics with the ferocity of berserkers and the discipline of monks. They were ready to leave behind the fjords of Norway, ready to carve their faith into the sands of the Holy Land, ready to face an enemy 40 times their number and see it not as death, but destiny. And in the spring of 1064, the northern seas roared beneath the keels of Magnus Barefoot's fleet, bearing holy war toward the desert sun. From the harbor of Bergen, long ships groaned beneath the weight of weapons, provisions, and men who had been remade through months of merciless training. The cries of women and children echoed through the fjords as the fleet pushed off, knowing that few, if any, would return. For those left behind, it was both pride and agony. These men sailed not for gold or conquest, but for something far stranger, redemption through blood. Their first stop lay west in the Orkney Islands. This was no coincidence. For centuries, Orkney had been the bridge between the Norse and the Celts. Here, Magnus enlisted hardened island mercenaries, veterans of storm and sword, men accustomed to Atlantic tempests and southern winds alike. They brought vital knowledge of warmer seas and connections to the trade routes stretching toward Iberia and beyond. From there, the fleet turned south, slicing across the deadly Bay of Biscay, a sea known to swallow ships whole. When they reached the coasts of Spain, they found their first taste of the war that awaited in the east. Local Muslim riders and archers clashed with the Norse in sharp skirmishes, testing the tactics Magnus had drilled into their bones. For the Vikings, it was revelation. They had fought Saxons, Danes, and Norse clans before, but never horsemen who struck from afar and vanished before a counterattack. At first, their ranks wavered beneath the rain of arrows. But Magnus had prepared them for this. Their discipline, cohesion, and drilled formations became their true weapons. Where once a Viking might charge blindly, now they moved as one, shields locked, spears bristling like a living wall. Each battle became a lesson. By the time they left Spain, the Norsemen had learned the rhythm of mounted warfare, and the truth that their greatest weapon was not steel, but fear itself. The Muslim fighters of Iberia were seasoned and skilled, yet nothing could prepare them for men who fought with joy even as arrows pierced their flesh. Warriors who sang hymns as they bled, whose strength seemed drawn not from survival, but from certainty that death was deliverance. Their fearlessness was infectious and terrifying, a weapon sharper than any axe. By winter, Magnus' fleet turned east, riding the shifting tides of the Mediterranean. One by one, they passed the ports of Christendom until, at last, Constantinople shimmered on the horizon, its domes and towers glowing in sunlight, the richest city the Norse had ever seen. To most, it was awe. To Magnus Barefoot, it was preparation. The road to Jerusalem was still long, and his men needed more than courage. They needed allies, new weapons, and the final transformation from Viking raiders into sanctified warriors of God. When Magnus' fleet reached the imperial harbor, it was as though they had sailed into another world. The city stretched endlessly, golden domes catching the sun, mosaics glittering like stars. For men from timber halls, it was overwhelming. A city built not from wood and will, but empire itself. To Magnus, however, it was an opportunity. The Byzantines had long hired Norsemen in their Varangian guard, warriors whose loyalty was bought with gold and whose axes had defended emperors. Magnus' arrival with 800 veterans was no accident. He came seeking trade, alliance, and mastery of new arts of war. The Byzantines obliged. In exchange for oaths and service, his men were welcomed into their military quarters. There, they trained beside imperial soldiers, learning shield wall tactics perfected through centuries of wars against Persians, Turks, and Bulgars. Engineers displayed siege engines and crossbows, weapons of mechanical genius unknown to the north. For Vikings, whose warfare had always been brutal and direct, these lessons in precision and strategy were revelation. But the most terrifying gift they received was fire, not common fire, but the legendary Greek fire, a weapon that clung to flesh and steel, burning hotter than the sun and unquenchable by water. It was said to be born from hell itself. Whether Magnus obtained the true formula or a lesser imitation is unknown, but it mattered little. His warriors soon learned to craft crude incendiaries of their own. To their enemies, flame was terror enough. Life in Byzantium deepened their spiritual metamorphosis. Monks in golden robes led processions through candlelit cathedrals, voices rising in endless chant. The Norse warriors knelt beside priests, crossing themselves awkwardly while still tracing runes on their shields in secret. Magnus encouraged it. He saw no contradiction between old gods and new faith. To him, their fusion was power, divine fury sharpened by ancient fire. By spring, the men who had entered Constantinople as Vikings emerged as something unrecognizable, soldiers of faith and flame. They were stronger, deadlier, and convinced their mission was ordained by heaven. When they turned their ships south toward Jerusalem, rumors raced ahead of them. Word spread across the Muslim world of a northern king with fire in his grasp and madmen at his side. In Damascus and Cairo, commanders scoffed. What were 800 against the hosts of Islam? But Magnus knew numbers could not stand against terror. The desert awaited, and with it, reckoning. By the time his fleet reached the Levantine coast, their legend had already arrived. Sailors whispered of northern zealots who fought like Byzantines but burned like demons. Traders told of men who did not flinch from arrows, who wielded fire stolen from hell itself. And when the Norse landed, the Muslim commanders were ready. Their leader was Emir Abu Nashams al-Muluk, a seasoned general famed for crushing Christian incursions. To him, this was not war, but an opportunity to annihilate a reckless northern band and remind the caliphate that Jerusalem was safe. Confident, he gathered his men, and by dawn his army swelled to over 40,000. Armored cavalry wielding scimitars curved like crescent moons. Mounted archers trained to strike and vanish. Disciplined infantry prepared for desert warfare. Even siege engines stood ready to crush fortresses the Vikings never dreamed of. Abu Nasa had every reason to believe this would be a display, not a battle. 800 men against his endless tide of warriors. How could the result ever be in question? Yet beneath his certainty lingered doubt. Reports described the Vikings as zealots who embraced death. Men who fought as if already judged yet blessed. Abu Nasa dismissed such claims as myths, though his younger officers were uneasy. Even the most seasoned army can falter when its foe refuses to die like men. The armies met southeast of Jerusalem, near Herodian's ancient fortress. There, the desert stretched wide and silent, its horizon blazing under the merciless sun. On one side, the Saris host stretched endlessly, banners rippling in the wind, hooves pounding like thunder across the earth. The sound alone, 40,000 men moving as one, was enough to shake veterans. On the other, the sight was almost absurd. A compact block of 800 Vikings, shields glinting, formations still and silent. No boasts, no cries, only calm men who knew their fate. To them, this was not survival. It was sacrifice. They had prayed, trained, bled for this hour. Now they stood to carve their names into eternity. Abu Nazar's plan was familiar. His cavalry would surround the Vikings. Archers would rain death from afar. When the line broke, infantry would close for slaughter. It had never failed before. It should not fail now. But Magnus expected it. He knew his enemy's pride and that the Sarissens believed this an easy conquest. They didn't know these 800 hadn't come to live. They had come to die spectacularly. As dawn broke and the first war horns echoed across the desert, the scene was set. On one side, an empire's pride. On the other, 800 zealots standing still, shields bright, axes eager. The storm was about to erupt. The sands trembled under a Bunia signal. Thousands of horsemen charged. Scimitars gleamed, momentum roaring like a wave across the dunes. Dust surged skyward. Shouts split the air. For a moment, the world itself seemed to rush toward the tiny Viking mass. Any normal army would have held tight, bracing for the crash, praying to survive. But Magnus' men did the unthinkable. Instead of standing firm, they split apart. The tight square of 800 broke into 8 smaller rings of 100 men each, spread like stones across a dry riverbed. To the charging cavalry, it looked like panic, as if the Vikings were breaking. But it wasn't chaos. It was design. This was the maneuver honed in Norway under Byzantine masters, a formation they called the Wheel of Death. Each ring bristled with shields and spears, its outer wall unbreakable, its inner ready to strike. The cavalry, expecting to shatter a solid wall, instead plunged into gaps between circles. Horses galloped through, only for the Viking rings to close behind, sealing escape. Instantly, clusters of Sarissens riders were trapped, their formations splintered, their numbers meaningless. What followed was carnage. Vikings attacked with mechanical precision, axes rising and falling in unison, shields smashing forward, spears dragging men from their mounts, blades tearing through flesh. In the choking dust, Sarissens cavalry found themselves encircled, attacked from every direction. The first wave disintegrated. Horses shrieked, riders crushed beneath hooves. Men who had expected to slaughter a weak foe now found themselves face to face with relentless killers. They had never fought warriors like these, men who moved as one, guided by some grim rhythm. What terrified them most wasn't skill. It was the eyes. The Vikings didn't fight for life. They fought as if life had already ended, each wound an offering to the gods. Arrows pierced shoulders, swords split flesh, yet they fought on without falter. Every strike a hymn, every death a prayer. It was as if they had risen beyond fear, beyond humanity itself. From his vantage, Abuna scowled. His first cavalry wave should have crushed the northerners with ease. Instead, 1,000 of his men lay dead on the sands. The sight chilled him. Those 8 circles of warriors stood firm like iron fortresses amid a sea of madness. It was not what Abu Nassa had foreseen, though he still trusted sheer numbers to prevail. Yet down on the sands, another truth took root. Sarissens riders who survived the first clash stumbled back in disbelief, whispering tales of demons cloaked in mortal skin. They spoke of men who smiled through agony, who struck together like a single monstrous creature, who fought not for triumph but transcendence. Terror spread like infection, unseen yet corrosive, unraveling the certainty of men unacquainted with fear. The first assault shattered, and though Abu Nazar commanded tens of thousands, something far deadlier than steel now stalked the field, the collapse of confidence. But Abu Naza was not a man easily moved. The loss of 1,000 riders was regrettable, but trivial beside his might. He adapted swiftly. If his cavalry could not crush the northerners by charge, then death would fall from above. Mounted archers, pride of his empire. They advanced in waves, bows bending in the blazing light. The order came. A black cloud of arrows rose, arched high, and plunged upon the Viking rings. The air hissed with the storm's breath, death descending like night. Any ordinary line would have broken beneath it. But Magnus' men held. They did not scatter or cry out. They crouched low, raising their shields in overlapping layers. The famed Skaldborg, a living fortress of iron and oak. Arrows clattered like rain, embedding deep, snapping on rims. Some found flesh, dropping men, yet the ranks sealed instantly. When one fell, another stepped forth, shield lifted. Their formation breathed, unyielding under the deluge. When the storm thinned, the Vikings revealed their reply. From behind their walls they hurled weapons of horror, barbed spears that hooked riders from saddles and, worse still, fire. Clay pots filled with flammable oil, crude kin to Byzantine Greek fire, ignited and hurled in blazing arcs. The desert exploded in flame. Wherever the pots burst, fire clung to skin, fabric, and horseflesh. Mounts screamed, rolling and trampling their riders. Warriors clawed at burning tunics, desperate to smother flames that water could not tame. The stench of charred flesh filled the air. From within the shield circles rose not silence but chant. The Norse voices roared in guttural hymns, their psalms carried on crackling heat. To their enemies, it was madness, men praying while unleashing hellfire. To the Vikings, it was worship. This was no mere battle, it was ritual. The sight unsettled Abu Naza. His archers, usually steadfast, began to waver. They were trained to slay from afar, not to face foes who burned the earth and sang as they killed. The emir's jaw tightened. He had meant to shatter enemy spirit with arrows. Instead, his own lines trembled. What raged before him was not battle, it was spectacle. Magnus and his captains grasped a deeper truth. War was won not by mass, but by terror, by rhythm, by flame, by theater. They had turned 800 men into something transcendent, a vision of judgment itself. And yet, the Vikings still concealed their deadliest secret, saving it for the moment when Abu Nasa hurled everything he had. By midday, the sun hung merciless overhead, scorching armor and baking throats to dust. Abunza could no longer deny his failure. His cavalry lay broken, his archers shaken by fire and fear. Still, he held one advantage: numbers. Tens of thousands of infantry stood ready to crush what remained. The emir gave the order. Drums pounded, horns screamed, and the desert floor quaked as more than 20,000 soldiers surged forward. Their advance was a living tide, stretching across the horizon. To the Saris host, this was destiny embodied. No force, no discipline, no courage could withstand such weight. The Northerners would be buried beneath sheer mass. But Magnus had waited for this. As the wall of men closed in, the Vikings signaled. Suddenly, the calm sands ignited. From each of the 8 circles, warriors unleashed their final gift to the gods: pots of fire, blazing projectiles, flung with perfect timing into the heart of the advancing army. The air shimmered with arcs of fire, glowing against the white blaze of the sky before exploding upon the sands. In an instant, the battlefield became a vision of hell. Rings of flame burst around the Viking lines, clinging to armor, fabric, and even the ground itself. Water could not quench it. The fire devoured the dry wind, burning brighter, hotter, crueler. Saris soldiers found themselves trapped between living fire and living steel. Panic surged like floodwaters through their ranks. Men clawed at burning comrades, igniting themselves in turn. What began as the confident march of thousands dissolved into madness. Infantry crushed one another in blind retreat, trampling the wounded. Officers screamed commands, but the roar of flame and agony drowned all order. And at the height of that chaos, the Vikings did the impossible. They broke from their circles, charging through their own firestorms, some already burning as they ran. Imagine the sight: warriors wreathed in flame, beards and cloaks ablaze, storming forward with axes raised, chanting psalms in Old Norse as they hacked into terrified ranks. To the Saris, it ceased to be war, it became nightmare. Those who lived swore the Northerners looked not like men but spirits of fire, demons risen from smoke, immune to pain, relentless even in death. Veterans who had fought Crusaders, Turks, and Persians fled in terror, believing they faced an unholy host. Abu Naza watched the field unravel. His great infantry, once his pride, collapsed into confusion, some falling back, others breaking entirely. His jaw tightened. He had not lost yet, but he knew this was no ordinary enemy. He was fighting terror made flesh, a vision crafted to break the human soul. Yet one force remained: his personal guard. 2,000 elite warriors, veterans of countless campaigns, armored in bronze and faith. If anyone could restore order, it would be them. Their command was simple: strike the serpent's head. Kill Magnus Barefoot, and the nightmare would end. The battlefield burned around them. Smoke, fire, screams, chaos. But through it all, Abu's golden banner still stood unbroken. From the rear lines, his guard advanced, their armor gleaming like molten metal in the sun. These were no conscripts. They were the elite of the desert, men who had never known defeat. Their mission was sacred: cut through the madness. Find the Norse leader and slay him. Magnus, towering above his men, stood in the heart of one Viking circle, his double-headed axe glinting with holy steel. He saw them coming and understood at once. This was the true test. He raised his arm. His chosen warriors gathered, forming a wedge of shield and fury. Then came the collision, a sound that split the desert. Shields shattered, horses screamed, blades rang like thunder. The elite guard met the Viking wedge, neither yielding an inch. These Saris did not panic. They fought with practiced precision, lances piercing deep, sabers flashing in graceful arcs. Yet the Vikings were past fear. Every wound made them louder. Every death made them stronger. Their chants rose over the fire's roar as they hacked, slammed, and crushed their way forward. It became a duel of worlds. discipline against devotion, order against obsession. And then, through the chaos, the two leaders found each other. Magnus Barefoot, the Norse king turned holy warlord, and Abu Naza, the battle-hardened emir. The desert seemed to pause as they closed the distance. Abu moved with elegance, a master of the curved blade trained in Damascus' finest schools, each motion precise and fluid. Magnus was raw might, towering, broad-shouldered, his axe an extension of his will. Yet he was not mere brutality. Byzantine tutors had given him control, his faith lent purpose. Their duel was thunder and lightning. Abu's blade flashed with speed, slashing for openings. Magnus' axe came down like judgment itself, each swing powerful enough to sunder steel. The emir danced, parried, struck, his mastery unmatched. But Magnus advanced unbroken, his roar echoing across the inferno. His blows were driven not just by brute force but by faith, the belief that every swing of his axe was guided by God himself. For minutes that felt like ages, the duel hung suspended between life and death. The emir's sharp precision clashed against Magnus' divine conviction. Steel screamed upon steel, echoing the collision of two worlds, discipline versus fanaticism, strategy against faith. Around them, warriors paused, their own struggles forgotten as they watched this clash of titans unfold. Then came the fatal heartbeat. Abu Nasr hesitated, just for an instant. Magnus seized it. His axe tore downward in a brutal arc, smashing through the emir's guard. The blade struck deep. Blood erupted like a crimson flower across the sand, and the emir collapsed, lifeless. Silence followed. The battlefield, once roaring with chaos, fell still. Thousands of Sarissens soldiers turned to see their commander motionless, his once proud banner drooping into the dust. To the Vikings, it was a sign from heaven. To the Sarissens, it was the unraveling of certainty itself. Their champion, undefeated through countless campaigns, lay slain by northern barbarians who fought like possessed souls. The fall of Abu Nasr wasn't just the loss of a leader, it was the shattering of an army spirit. For a moment, time froze. The cries of battle faded. Across the sands, men stared in disbelief at the lifeless body of their emir. Then, like dry grass catching flame, panic spread. Fear crept through the ranks, whispering a single dreadful thought. If even he could die, who among us can stand? What had begun as a disciplined host of 40,000 turned into chaos. Soldiers broke ranks, trampling their comrades in desperate flight. Magnus, drenched in sweat and blood, saw it unfold with grim certainty. Victory was his. Yet mercy was not. There would be no survivors. His order came cold, absolute, a curse carved into memory. To the Vikings, this was not cruelty, it was holy duty. Their mission had never been simple conquest, it was purification. The slaughter was their offering to God, sanctified in fire and blood. For 3 relentless days, the desert became a graveyard. The Vikings, fewer than 1,000, moved like predators among prey. They hunted with methodical precision, cutting off escape routes, ambushing fleeing groups, and driving survivors into killing grounds. Their experience from distant campaigns in Spain and Byzantium now manifested in pure, ruthless efficiency. On the first day alone, 10,000 Sarissens soldiers were slain, many unarmed, cut down as they fled. On the second, 15,000 more perished. The sands turned red, the air choked with the stench of burning corpses left beneath the merciless sun. By the third day, all that remained of Abu Nasr's once mighty host were scattered fragments, exhausted, broken, leaderless. The Vikings gave no rest, no reprieve. Each kill was performed as ritual. Before delivering death, they muttered prayers, dedicating each strike to divine judgment. Their psalms rose above the wind, eerie and unending, echoing across the dunes like chants of the damned. Those who escaped swore they had seen demons, not men, warriors with fire in their eyes, their skin blackened by soot, their voices singing hymns as they butchered. They called them the damned of the north. By the time Magnus called an end to the massacre, over 35,000 Sarissens soldiers lay dead. Of the 800 Vikings who had marched into the desert, scarcely 230 had fallen. It was an impossible outcome, one that no historian could explain except by invoking divine wrath or infernal power. The plains south of Jerusalem were no longer a battlefield but a monument to annihilation, a warning carved in flesh and fire. When silence finally descended, only the dead bore witness to what had transpired. The dunes were littered with corpses, tens of thousands of them, sprawled in grotesque stillness. For the Vikings, it was a sacred offering. For the survivors, it was an omen of the world's end. Word of the slaughter spread faster than any army could march. Messengers galloped from Jerusalem to Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo, their voices trembling with horror. They told of 800 northern warriors who had destroyed an army 50 times their size. Men who fought as if blessed or cursed, men who seemed to embrace death as salvation. At first, rulers and scholars scoffed at the reports. The numbers defied logic. 800 cannot defeat 40,000, they said. But logic soon withered beneath proof. Survivors arrived in waves, bodies scarred by fire, flesh split by axes, eyes haunted by terror. Their stories were identical. They had faced not soldiers, but monsters cloaked in faith. They described men whose chants carried over the inferno, whose axes gleamed like instruments of judgment. Their fear infected courts and cities alike. From that day forward, whispers of the damned of the north spread through taverns, temples, and palaces. Mothers warned their children with the tale. Priests spoke of divine punishment. Generals studied the horror with trembling hands. And deep in the heart of Jerusalem's deserts, where the sands still hid bones beneath the shifting winds, a legend was born. The legend of the Holy Berserkers, the Viking host that turned the desert into a cathedral of fire and silence. A warning to those who thought faith could not make men into gods, or into monsters. If a small band of Christian zealots could annihilate such a massive force, what would happen if greater armies marched under the same divine fire? The massacre became a phantom that haunted the minds of men, a ghost lingering over every map, every council, every prayer. Even far from the battlefield, in markets and ports untouched by war, people whispered of the northern demons. Mothers silenced their children with the threat that Magnus fire worshippers would come for the disobedient. Meanwhile, the Vikings wasted no time. They understood that fear, once born, must be nurtured. Magnus and his surviving warriors paraded through captured villages, their blood-stained axes raised high, their chants of psalms echoing like a sermon of steel. They wanted the world to see what divine favor looked like. To the oppressed Christians of the East, these men were deliverers. To others, they were omens. Within weeks, their force swelled. From 800 survivors, they grew to nearly 3,000, an army of zealots, converts, and adventurers who saw in Magnus not merely a warrior, but a prophet. Rumors ran faster than they marched. Entire cities surrendered at the sound of their approach. Garrisons abandoned their walls without a fight. To oppose Magnus, it was said, was to defy the will of God himself. Chroniclers and storytellers embroidered their deeds until history gleamed like myth. Some claimed angels had fought beside the Norsemen, their flaming swords cutting through ranks of unbelievers. Others swore arrows shattered harmlessly upon armor blessed by holy rites. Whether or not any believed the details mattered little. The terror was real. The massacre near Jerusalem had become more than a battle. It was a weapon of faith, sharpened into fear. Magnus and his men had done more than win a victory. They had rewritten the laws of psychological warfare. Armies now marched not just with swords, but with stories. Tales of their triumph raced across the Mediterranean faster than ships could sail. Traders, pilgrims, and mercenaries carried the legend westward, across deserts, over mountains, and into Europe's heart. By the time it reached the cathedrals and courts of France, the truth had changed shape. In the telling, the numbers grew. The legend now spoke of 800 northern warriors who faced 50 times their number and destroyed an army of 40,000. Chroniclers, eager to glorify divine will, turned slaughter into miracle. They wrote of glowing axes and holy fire, of men who fought without fear or mercy. The reality had been horrifying enough, but legend made it sacred. The timing was nothing short of providential. In Rome, Pope Urban II was preparing his great summons to arms, to reclaim the Holy Land from infidels. For years, he had searched for a story powerful enough to unite Christian Europe. The tale of Magnus Barefoot's massacre became that story. If 800 Norsemen could crush Islam's armies, what might 50,000 crusaders achieve under the banner of the cross? If God had blessed a handful of fanatics, surely he would sanctify a united Christendom. Preachers seized the myth like fire. Across France and Germany, churches filled with echoes of Magnus' miracle. Priests painted vivid pictures of Viking martyrs wreathed in smoke, their psalms rising as they struck down unbelievers. To the faithful, it was not only inspiring, it was proof. Proof that heaven intervened. Proof that victory could be divine. The tale did what armies alone could not. It ignited belief. Knights who heard it felt destiny calling. To fight in the Holy Land was no longer about gold or power. It was a holy summons, a chance to stand where the damned of the North had stood, to bleed where heaven itself had drawn its sword. Thousands took the cross, convinced that their cause had already been sanctified in fire and blood. And so, the massacre near Jerusalem became more than memory. It became a rallying cry, a myth that marched alongside men. From the lips of survivors to the pens of monks, from the pulpits of priests to the ears of kings, the legend spread, transforming terror into faith, horror into purpose. In truth, the legend proved mightier than the battle itself. What mattered was not the 35,000 corpses left beneath the desert sun, but the conviction those corpses planted in Europe's heart, that God had chosen warriors to reclaim his land, and miracles would guide them. The flames Magnus Barefoot lit did not die with him. They crossed seas and mountains, kindling all of Europe, until the first crusading hosts began to form, armies of nobles, peasants, and dreamers who marched eastward not for plunder, but for prophecy. The massacre near Jerusalem was not just victory, it was blueprint. Magnus and his 800 had proven that numbers meant nothing against belief. They had shown that terror, when wrapped in holiness, could become the mightiest weapon of all. In the decades that followed, the lesson endured. The Crusader orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutons, all bore echoes of Magnus' legacy. Small brotherhoods of warriors bound not only by training but by faith. Faith that men could be forged into miracles. Faith that death itself could be conquered through conviction. And so, from one impossible slaughter in the sands of Jerusalem, a movement was born. A crusade fueled by legend, sustained by faith, and destined to change the world forever. They combined prayer with steel and faith with fury, understanding that power wasn't only about the sword but also about fear. Cities surrendered not merely to their armies, but to the legend that marched before them. The principles Magnus Barefoot had pioneered, terror, relentlessness, and divine justification, became a blueprint for centuries of warfare. His use of fear as a weapon, the deliberate massacres, and the public executions weren't just tactics, they were statements. Christian chroniclers called it divine justice. Their enemies called it barbarism. Yet in the brutal logic of medieval war, morality mattered less than results. Weapons once confined to Byzantium, like fire that clung to flesh, became symbols of dread. Muslim defenders trembled as they saw the Christians unleash burning liquids that could not be extinguished. Magnus' fire echoed through time. More than just a weapon, it became a myth. But his most enduring legacy wasn't physical, it was psychological. Magnus proved that faith could be forged into a weapon far sharper than steel. His men fought not for plunder, but for divine purpose. Their conviction made them unstoppable. That idea spread through Europe like wildfire, transforming holy war into something darker, a moral license for absolute brutality. For the Vikings, the massacre turned them into legends. Songs sang of their stand in the desert, a fusion of glory and horror. Some saw them as martyrs, others as demons. Either way, their name became a weapon itself. In medieval warfare, reputation was power. Yet their story did not fade among their enemies. In the Muslim world, it became a haunting memory, a lesson that even the mightiest army could fall before men who feared no death. For generations, the story of the northern fanatics was whispered across battlefields, a ghostly warning of what zeal could unleash. Magnus Barefoot would never see the storm he set in motion. In 1069, 5 years after the massacre, he fell in battle near Antioch. His death was ordinary, but his legend was not. In Scandinavia, songs immortalized the holy slaughter. Churches were raised in his name. The survivors were hailed as saints in armor, their scars seen as signs of God's favor. They became heroes of faith, proof that divine conviction could overcome impossible odds. Their tale inspired generations who later marched east under the banner of the First Crusade. But what had Magnus and his 800 truly achieved? On the surface, they accomplished the impossible, defeating an army 50 times their size. Yet their true triumph wasn't in numbers, it was in belief. Their unshakable conviction made them something beyond soldiers. They fought with the certainty that death was not defeat, but glory. Pain was not suffering, but devotion. That mindset turned them into instruments of awe and terror alike. Men who broke the courage of thousands simply by refusing to yield. Their victory revealed a timeless truth: numbers do not decide battles, spirit does. The will to fight, the belief in purpose, can outweigh sheer size or strength. The Vikings proved that once fear infects the heart of an army, no wall or weapon can save it. Yet their victory also exposed the darker side of faith. The same zeal that fueled courage also justified cruelty. The same devotion that made them heroic also made them monstrous. Belief, by itself, is neither holy nor evil. It is the cause it serves that defines it. To Christians, Magnus' men were holy warriors, proof that God's hand guided them. To Muslims, they were demons, creatures of fire and madness. Both perceptions held truth. Both revealed the danger of conviction unrestrained. The massacre at Jerusalem was not merely an episode of violence. It was a mirror held up to human nature, showing both its brilliance and its brutality. Courage, loyalty, and cruelty intertwined in a single, unforgettable act. Nearly 1,000 years later, their story still resonates. It forces us to question the line between faith and fanaticism. Was their devotion noble or horrifying? Perhaps it was both. What cannot be denied is that it was extraordinary. Magnus Barefoot and his 800 warriors shattered the illusion of impossibility. They showed that men united by belief could defy logic, topple armies, and rewrite history. They proved that faith, when wielded like a sword, could burn brighter and more dangerously than fire itself. In the end, the massacre at Jerusalem was more than a battle. It was a revelation. A moment when humanity learned that conviction can move more than mountains. It can move men to greatness or to madness. Magnus' story remains both a warning and an inspiration, a testament to the terrifying power of belief and to the price of wielding it without mercy.